All right, so it is 12:31, so I definitely want to respect everyone's time. Let me fix my microphone here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's discussion. So, welcome to Talk Tuesday. This is being recorded and will be available for use after this event. Talk Tuesday is a virtual series of workshop conversations that provides a forum that amplifies the voices of marginalized and/or underrepresented communities around various topics centered around intersectionality and social justice. The series plans to serve as a catalyst to promote, celebrate, and increase cultural awareness at Georgia State University, encourage cross-cultural dialogue and engagement, and advance global and intercultural fluency and cultural competency. Each workshop topic is uniquely designed and expertly facilitated to create a safe environment for authentic conversation, varying viewpoints, and cultural exchange. Selected guest speakers help to shift personal paradigms and facilitate learning and understanding through their scholarship, service, and storytelling. The topics and speakers presented do not represent the views of the Multicultural Center or Georgia State University, but are intended to reflect contemporary social concerns. All are welcome to take part in these cultural conversations. I am your host, William Brito, and on this Talk Tuesday, Facts and Fiction about Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, panelists will engage in dialogue around the historical context to the practices of celebrating Columbus Day and the Thanksgiving holiday, as well as explore why these celebrations are harmful to Native American and Indigenous peoples' cultures and histories. The idea of Christopher Columbus as an intrepid hero has also been called into question. Upon arriving in the Bahamas, the explorer and his men forced the native peoples they found there into slavery. Later, while serving as the governor of Hispaniola, present day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, he allegedly imposed barbaric forms of punishment, including torture. Although Columbus's landing in the New World marked the start of a new age of exploration and development for the world, the reality of European colonization is that it brought disease, enslavement, and genocide to the indigenous people of the Americas. This part of colonial history has largely been left unrecognized. The widely circulated story of Thanksgiving involves Native Americans and Europeans collectively agreeing to live in harmony and celebrated this unity with this special feast. According to other historical accounts, European settlers allied with the Wampanoag people against the rival tribe, however, brought disease, exploited resources, and took land from the Wampanoag people. Our panelists today include Dr. Gina Kaysen, Associate Professor of English at Georgia State University, Amanda Dominique, graduate student in the Department of Religious Studies here at Georgia State University, Sheena Roteman, Georgia State University alumni and Atlanta Indigenous Peoples Association, and Dr. Natsu Taylor Saito, who is a Regents Professor and Professor of Law here at Georgia State University. Dr. Saito will be joining us a little later in our conversation today. So, without further ado, let us get started. So, our first topic or our first question for our panelists is tell us about yourself and your connection with Native American and Indigenous cultures. And so we'll start with Dr. Queso.
If it's okay, I'd like to start with the Indigenous people on the panel and the student alumni, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Queso.
Great, thank you.
I guess that would be me. My name is Sheena Roteman. I am Lakota, originally from South Dakota. I'm sorry about my dog. He's being very needy right now. And let's see, I graduated from Georgia State, I believe in 2010. And I was journalism and English major. I was the editor-in-chief of the Signal at my time, during my time there. And I spent 6 years at the Atlanta Press Club, and now I'm the education manager at the Native American Journalists Association.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sheena. And so either Amanda or Dr. Queso, as we wait for Dr. Saito to join us.
Okay, thanks. I'm Gina Kaysen. As you mentioned, I'm a professor in the English department. I am non-native. I grew up on Occaneechi-Saponi lands in present-day North Carolina, and I've been at Georgia State since 2012. I have a PhD in English and Native American Studies from the University of California, Davis, and I've worked with Indigenous, in addition to teaching Indigenous literatures, I've worked with Indigenous communities, particularly in California, on issues of repatriation and human remains studies and sovereignty movements and recognition movements with communities in California. And since coming to Georgia State, because I was able to get Indigenous literature courses on the books and pass those through the English department as existing coursework, I've had the great fortune to work with a number of the Indigenous students who are at the university and help them facilitate a stronger community for Indigenous students here on campus. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Kaysen. And lastly, Amanda Dominique.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a first year graduate student in the Department of Religious Studies here at Georgia State. I come from Ohio and then some time in Alabama. My kind of connection with this work is doing an undergraduate thesis on the Native American Church and some legal rights with peyote. And then I'm just currently trying to do my best to be an ally in the best way I can. Thanks, y'all.
Absolutely. And as I said, mentioned previously, thank you, Amanda. As I mentioned previously, we do have another panelist joining us in a few. And so when they join us after the answering of the second question, we'll go back and let them introduce themselves as well. So as we wait, without further ado, and we'll start with the second question. So we cannot discuss the facts and fictions around Columbus Day and Thanksgiving without acknowledging the commonality of both histories and holidays being deeply rooted to the land. Please share more insight on the tribes who inhabited this land that the university currently sits on here in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'll open it up with Sheena and then Dr. Kaysen and then Amanda, if you all would like to contribute. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. So, so again, I'm Lakota, and I'm originally from Wyoming, South Dakota area, but I have been in Atlanta for about 20 years now. And from my understanding, and my two panelists might actually know more about this than I do, but so please correct me if I'm wrong. But from my understanding, we're on Muskogee and Cherokee land. Atlanta is kind of a, it used to be Terminus City because it's where all the train tracks were and or are still really, and kind of a crossroads of sorts. And that was actually true long before settlers came. Atlanta was really kind of a crossroads and meeting place for Cherokee and Muskogee mainly, but of course other tribes in the area.
Thank you, Sheena. Dr. Kaysen?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that going off what Sheena said, realizing that this space has a long history, which sometimes Atlanta, as the municipal government that it is, and kind of the capitalist enthused city that it is, we think it's a place that tears down its history, but there's a long history here that predates that phenomenon, and it can be easy to miss if one doesn't stop and look. It's not all in the past. The places still exist, these landmarks still exist, and it's about self-education and learning to slow down and pay attention to those things. And I think that that's a good way to kind of start this conversation and thinking about how to be have a relationship of paying attention to this space.
And I just want to jump in real fast and say that's a really good point. A lot of people think that Atlanta was completely destroyed and burnt in the Civil War, and a lot of it was, but there are still a lot of landmarks and things around that, you know, again, just if you keep your eyes open, you'll notice lots of names, lots of street names are Indigenous.
Absolutely. So our last panelist has joined us. So we have Dr. Natsu Saito. So Dr. Saito, if you could tell us about yourself and your connection with Native American and Indigenous cultures.
Yes, I'm sorry to be late. It's a pleasure to join you all here. So I'm Natsu Saito, and um, I have my background. I'm not Indigenous to North America. My background is that I'm Japanese American, but I've always been interested in issues of race and the law, and that's what I study and teach about. And as I started to try to understand what had happened to Japanese Americans in this country, and living in the South, I soon realized that I really needed to understand what the history of Black folks in this country. And as I got into that, I realized that I couldn't understand any of this without really understanding Indigenous issues. And I've really come to see that as foundational to understanding anything about race in this country. And in the meantime, I have been married um, to twice, both times, to people who are Indigenous as well as mixed with other backgrounds, but also Indigenous. And so I've gotten to be sort of part of a larger Indigenous community, especially in Colorado, before we moved back here. But that has really shaped my understanding of the world and has helped make sense of everything about life for me. So it's been really important to me to be able to connect at that level with other folks who care about these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saito. We were on the second question, so I will reread the second question, or technically our first question. And I'll throw it to Amanda. Amanda, if you wanted to contribute, and then Dr. Saito, if you'd like to add as well. So please share more insight on the tribes who inhabited this land that the university currently sits on here in Atlanta, Georgia, was the crux of our second question. So Amanda, did you want to contribute to that one?
Absolutely. So I use a four-part kind of framework whenever I'm doing a land acknowledgement like this. You kind of mentioned like who was here, Muskogee, what happened, and like having this confederate of tribes. The third part I always include is where are they now? So the Muskogee is a federally recognized tribe with land in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. And then the fourth part would be who is still here now. In Georgia, there are 4 state recognized tribes, but none of them are federally recognized. I think the population is approximately 150,000. Indigenous peoples are still living in our state. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. And Amanda, there's a little bit of bandwidth issue, I think. So if you wanted to put those 4 stages in the chat for us, that would be awesome. And I think, Sheena, you were getting ready to contribute as well.
I just wanted to say there's quite a few, not just in Georgia, but throughout the continent, tribes that aren't even state recognized. There's quite a few people that have no official recognition.
Jeez. Thank you. And Dr. Saito, would you like to contribute to that question before we move on to our next one?
No, except that I just appreciate the fact that y'all are paying attention to that, and I think it's so important for us to remember that all the time, wherever we are.
Absolutely. Thank you all. All right, so moving on to our next question. So let's begin with a little word association. So when thinking about Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, what words come to mind and why?
I don't want to say them because they're bad words.
Go ahead. This is Talk Tuesday. Go ahead, Sheena.
Murder, rape, chaos.
Hmm. And so why those particular words?
I mean, I think, you know, we're all adults, we're all well educated. We all know that the little fairy tale that we were told in first grade or second grade or whatever isn't true or isn't accurate. It so maybe whatever happened on the day that Columbus landed in this hemisphere, we'll never know exactly what happened, minute by minute. But more importantly to this story, it set off a chain of events that eventually wiped out millions of people, countless civilizations, cities, technologies, languages, cultures, beliefs. It really set off a true genocide that arguably is still occurring today.
Thank you, Sheena. Anyone else? The first words that come to mind and why?
I mean, I think for me, it's genocide is also, I mean, that is often the word. I mean, there is no getting around that reality in this history. And I often talk to students in classes to also give space that this is understandably emotional stuff when we have these classes and conversations, to recognize what you're asking everyone to engage with are all the things that come up when we consider genocide carefully and respectfully, and just acknowledge that that should be a hard conversation for everyone. And what type of energy do we expect different people to have to bring into those conversations? And to give that space, because that word is in all of this history at every stage, regardless of what it's called legally, whether we call it removal, termination, relocation, colonialism, exploration. It all comes down, I think, to me, for that word, and acknowledging the weight that we carry when we engage with that word.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Kaysen.
I really agree. That's the word that comes to mind for me too. And for me, it evokes such images of very specific images that come, of course, from the particular histories that I happen to have read. But, and I hate to even, it's difficult to even talk about them, right? Because if you're not, as you were just saying, in the proper space to acknowledge it and to appreciate it, it can become like sort of like violence porn or something. And yet those are the images that are evoked for those of us who have have looked even superficially into the history, right? Horrific things that were done very deliberately. Not this, oh wow, we turned around and the Indians were all gone kind of, thing. But very deliberate massacres and just done in such horrific ways, very intentionally. And so the other word that really comes to mind to me when I think about these so-called holidays is denial, because that's what's so frustrating to me is not only do they evoke the horrors and the need to recognize and properly respect all that has happened and the spirits of those folks and the what's happening with communities today and all of that, but then we have to always confront this, and it's not just sort of blissful ignorance, right? I think it's a very deliberate you know unwillingness to think about difficult things and to insist that oh, have a happy whatever, and like we're all of a sudden the party poopers, right? If we say well, actually we don't celebrate, and here's why. But it's just I think the denial piece is really important, because I feel like we're never going to get anywhere until people are willing to confront that denial.
Thank you, Dr. Saito. Does anyone else want to answer before we move to the next question?
Yeah, can I chime in?
Absolutely, Amanda.
Kind of building off that idea of denial, some of the first words that come to mind for me would come from my upbringing and like my early elementary education, that we're doing that like cover up work, like, oh, Columbus Day is celebrating our American heritage and like these values of our country. And then Thanksgiving, we're going to make hand paper turkeys and talk about friendship and sharing. But like those were the words that you get before you start doing the work. As Dr. Saito mentioned, like then once you start uncovering like the reality, the real terms of genocide, forced removal, exploitation, colonization kind of come to mind for me.
All right, thank you all so much. We move on to our next question. I know that that question was a little heavy, but we did want to start it off just to kind of paint the picture for the rest of our conversation. So, in regard to our discussion around the beginnings of Thanksgiving involving European settlers and the Wampanoag people, how did these stories become misconstrued? And that is open to anyone. How did these stories become misconstrued?
I mean, it's a multi-layered. There's not one moment when, you know, a secret meeting of people got together and said, we will, this is now the narrative of this day. I think when we look at Wampanoag history and the Northeast in particular, we have to look at other moments when, like Amanda said, coming from the last question, where people were looking for a narrative to create an idea of an America. And that still happens. We always see people looking back to moments to justify their own existence in this space and their own resource extraction and their own entitlement to do that. So when we look at each of those holidays, they have various types of history, whether it's to attempt to incorporate an Italian American community into an idea of whiteness to maintain structural racism, whether it's to incorporate a justification for land, whether it's an act of appropriation of an Indigenous celebration, you know, always in the service of whiteness and American identity being woven together. And so I find it difficult. I would love to hear what the other panelists think about this, but I find it difficult to say, well, you know, this was the moment when this happened, because it's a constant act of reinventing to maintain legal and social structures in this space we currently call the US.
I love the
Yes,
way you
Doc.
did that. I think that was, yeah, that's a really great description of I think we've seen that as quickly ramping up the past 6 years or so too of narratives kind of being built to maintain certain status quo. I could be wrong. I don't know if there's any historians here, but I hope so, because I hope to be fact checked on this if I am wrong. But I think there was, I want to say Thanksgiving wasn't exactly a like an American holiday up until I want to say Victorian era. And that was when oh my gosh, I can't remember exactly like why, but it became a federal holiday.
1937.
Yes, thank you. Around that time, and oh, thank you. And I don't remember the reasoning they gave or anything like that, but it didn't become, you know, early Americans didn't celebrate this.
And I think that, yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, that these are done to glorify, as someone said, you know, American values, right? Supposed values, because all of the horrors of American history are justified by saying, but look at what we got out of it. Like, you know, this was a harsh price to pay, but, you know, without it, we couldn't have this wonderful, you know, beacon of light for the world kind of triumphalist imagery. And that's part of the story that's being told, right? And I don't think, you know, and in 1937, I don't know exactly what was going on for Roosevelt, but it was the Depression, right? And there was a need to bring Americans together to say, you know, this is really a wonderful country and we're all going to hang in here together. And if you look at Columbus Day, the first Columbus Day was celebrated in 1906 in Denver. Um, and I mean, think about what was happening in 1906, right? And think about what was happening here in Atlanta in 1906. There were pogroms of black neighborhoods. And, you know, if y'all have been following what happened in Decatur with the removal of that cannon, right? That cannon was put up in the Decatur Square commemorating the quote Indian War of 1836 in 1906 by the Daughters of the Confederacy because they couldn't raise enough money yet to put up the Confederate memorial that they then subsequently put up 2 years later. But this was a time when they were feeling the need to celebrate the consolidation of their control, the white settlers' control of the continent, and then to start expanding out to in more imperial ventures overseas. And they were really clear that, you know, celebrating what they saw as the elimination of indigenous peoples and the acquisition of all the land was foundational to everything else they wanted to do, including, you know, the enslavement of Africans.
Yeah, and to like build on to that of like how we're creating this history, I think a big part is like our education system, like working in the classrooms, you know, you see these textbooks that are being written by history's winners, right? And so whose voices are we, you know, listening to when we learn the history? Who gets to say what this means or why it matters is really, I think, an essential point as well.
Thank you, panelists. Any more contributions to this question before we move on to our next one?
Just real fast, what Amanda just said, and actually what she said earlier, has me thinking too about, again, we're all here in an academic setting, but it does make me wonder about how to teach these things to children. Because like we said earlier, these are very heavy topics that kids don't necessarily have the understanding or the capacity to understand the enormity of it all. So how do we, and I don't know, I'm just putting that out there. I'm not trying to derail the conversation, but it just, I constantly think about how to talk to children about this.
Can I say one thing about that?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yes.
please.
You know, it is really hard, right? It's very difficult to raise this stuff with kids, but I feel like it's absolutely critical to do so and to do so with as much truth as we can without just, you know, having them shut down. And I'm thinking about how when we used to live in Colorado, every year for a long time, you know, our annual activity on Columbus Day was to go have protests of the Italian American Columbus Day parade. But one of the things that was so important to us in the community there, and it was a large coalition, but it was organized primarily by the American Indian community and the AIM chapter in Denver, but was that our kids, in that sense, the indigenous kids in the community, they're being taught this stuff, you know, in school, right? And they're being taught to glorify somebody who was a genocidal maniac, and you know, their being, right, was being not just erased, but you know, they were being, the message that they were getting was, this is a good thing that these horrible things happen to you and your people. And for, you know, and in communities where we have incredible youth suicide rates and all sorts of other issues, right? Um, like, I feel like if children aren't given the truth, they look around and they see the realities. They see who's poor. They see who's, you know, drug addicted. They see who's, you know, in jail. They see who's being killed by the police. And if they don't have a historical grounding to explain it, then they'll internalize it and they'll say there must be something wrong with us. And so I feel like it's absolutely critical in all of our communities to really, let the kids see how the current realities came about, because even if it's harsh, because I think the consequences otherwise are even more harsh for them.
Thank you, Dr. Saito. Moving on to our next question, panelists. Many Indigenous folks refuse to celebrate Thanksgiving, recognizing it as a day of mourning in which they protest the whitewashing of the horrors their ancestors went through. How did the narratives of conquer and destroy, presented by both Christopher Columbus and Thanksgiving, become those of celebration and community? And for American communities that celebrate Thanksgiving, is it possible to celebrate this holiday while also acknowledging its truth and history?
I'll jump in. It's hard to say that I do or don't celebrate Thanksgiving. I guess I do. Like, I go to my family's house and we cook a ton of food, and so okay, we celebrate. But we do that all the time. It's not, and this is a lot of Indigenous people, including my family that I know, it's kind of like this, is that isn't a once a year or a couple times a year thing. That's like every Sunday. And that's how I've heard a lot of other Indigenous people explain it, is we celebrate Thanksgiving all the time. It's in our culture. It's built into our language, to always be giving thanks. So, I mean, yeah, I'll take a day off work. I'll always take a day off work. But don't tell my boss. But it's I think we also just acknowledge that it's, kind of roll our eyes and just saying like, okay, well, at least we have good food to eat, so.
Thank you, Sheena. Dr. Kaysen?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that Sheena made. I often tell students that there's nothing wrong with having a position of gratitude in the world. There is nothing wrong with an attitude of giving thanks. But if you want to consolidate that to one day a year, I start to question your commitment to gratitude a little bit. And I think to ask, what are you giving thanks for? What are you grateful for? And a position of thanks or gratitude without acknowledgement of harm in education is a very shallow practice. And so if one wants to take that position, I think you have to actually dig in and decide, what does not only education, knowledge, but then what are you going to do to move past something that may just be a feeling of guilt or shame about something into a material, what comes next? And so that's, rather than thinking of this as a one day a year that then just replicates some myth, right? Rather, start to imagine, what does that look like for the other 364 days of your life, about all of the things that went into making your existence in this place possible, and what that means for how you should live your life and engage with that going forward. So, I mean, maybe the problem is, it gets that America likes to think of it as one day. Okay, so glad I was thankful for something next, rather than a fundamental shift in attitude of how we should live in gratitude with those things around us. And do you really want to say you're grateful or giving thanks for stolen goods? I'm not really sure that that's totally epistemologically possible if you think through what that means. So that's how I try to think about it. I'm, old but still growing up, so I always welcome refinement of that position.
Thank you, Dr. Kaysen, for sharing. Amanda or Dr. Saito, would you like to contribute?
Yeah, I appreciate that as well, Dr. Kaysen. I think for me, like the biggest thing coming to mind right now would be like choice. We don't need to make this a prescriptive holiday if folks do not see it as a holiday, or if folks want to choose to rename it as the day of mourning. Like, I would want to honor that and welcome that into all of our spaces. The other thing I'm thinking is, like, just historically, this Thanksgiving idea, like, that was a ritual in the Wampanoag used of offering foods and objects to show that thanks to the earth. But when we're remembering history, we don't just want to remember the parts that we like or that we enjoy, or that, like, we had a meal together and it was lovely. Like, that meal was a political alliance. It was not just friendly times. And we have to also acknowledge the rest of history that came after that was the genocide and the forced removal. So those would be my top thoughts right now.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, we usually see it as a day of mourning, but that's also tied in a funny way to Thanksgiving, right? Because, I mean, this was obviously there were countless massacres, but there were some really big ones around this time of year, right? Sand Creek, Washita, Wounded Knee coming up. So there's a lot, especially if in the the northern plains, that you can't be in that space in that time of year without thinking about that. But that also, I think, allows us to think about survival, right? And one of the things I found with my students when they start to learn this history is they get so depressed, right? Like, what's the point? Like, we have this hundreds of years of, just these horrible things happening over and over again. And it really helps them, I think, and it helps me to think about, you know, the way I often think about it is if they're trying to kill us all off and we're still here, then we're winning, right? And the fact that lots has been lost, but there's been incredible survival as well, and that is something to be very grateful for, I think, and to remember and to honor, because if it's easy for us to feel discouraged, but if we think about what our ancestors went through, it's like nothing compared to that. And so it in a funny way, it brings us back around to being grateful, I think.
It's kind of humbling, I think, to think of what my ancestors. I'm Chikongo Lokota, so rosebud, and Chikongo means burnt thighs because my ancestors they were fleeing the U.S. government. The government had set the prairie on fire, and they had to run through the burning grass. So they called us burnt thighs because we had charred up legs. And I think there's been many times, especially when I was in college and trying to graduate, where I thought, you can do this because your ancestors did much worse. So it's very humbling. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Sheena. All right, moving to our next question. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln moved and pushed for Thanksgiving to become a national holiday to unite the country and build community. How do you believe this holiday declaration impacted Native communities? And you kind of touched on this briefly a little bit, Sheena. I think there's a pretty decent amount of history around Thanksgiving. But as we said, one of the stipulations was President Lincoln using it as a way to unite the nation during the Civil War. How did that further impact these Native communities?
Well, in talking about the Civil War, I think it's important to bring up something we haven't really touched on yet, in that Native communities and enslaved people were very intertwined, especially where we are in the South, obviously, but especially like coastal communities. So I think it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous isn't just a cut and dry blood quantum type situation, but a lot of our Black citizens here are also Indigenous, and there's been, I'm not going to name any names, but certain tribes that have tried to deny that. and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that this isn't just about Indigenous people, especially when we're dealing with the Civil War. This is also about Black people. So I don't know the answer to this question, but I do have to wonder. It's interesting to think about. Let's unite the country, but more than half the population can't vote. So that's all I gotta say about that.
Got you. Thank you for sharing, Sheena. Anyone of our other panelists, would you like to take a crack at this particular question?
Can I just add one little thing that I have been learning about recently that I didn't know? I sort of knew a little bit, but I've been finding that there's a lot more interesting work being done on it about the sort of Black Native connections and how um, there was a a major slave trade in the early years of the colonies from the Northeast, where indigenous peoples who were captured were enslaved. The piece I hadn't known about is written in Alan Galay's book, I think, about how uh, in many cases the men were shipped to the West Indies, but the women were sent to plantations in the South. And then subsequently, because the law of race in the US, it's state by state, but it's so crazy, right? That in a lot of the southern states, if you were enslaved, you were by definition Black. So enslaved indigenous people, um, right, in the southern plantations were on the census or whatever officially labeled Black. And then of course there was, lots of intermixing also, but it's a much richer and more complex history than I think we're generally led to believe.
Thank you, Dr. Saito. Yes, Dr. Kaysen?
I think going off of this, I know we're talking about Columbus Day and Thanksgiving as harmful in particular, but we've just recently seen this in our city this week on an NPR show that shall remain nameless in the city. They talked about the World Series win as this great bringing together of everyone across the city, regardless of class and race and this.
Yes.
And that all of that is at the expense of Indigenous people. I mean, I often almost wreck my car with anger with things I hear on the radio, so I try to keep myself calm, and not call in and yell every time. However, I you know, we also have to interrogate things that even the things that we may like, and I would encourage like students and listeners and people there to ask themselves, even for something like a World Series win, how Native communities and individuals are often caricatured and then made into the thing that is supposed to reconcile and bring together. And, it happens again and again in a lot of ways that Native histories and images and peoples are used in service of moments of city American and other supposed racial reconciliation. And that is something that we saw as recently as last Friday. So it's not just something that Abraham Lincoln did. It's something that a vast majority of the people in the city did in the last 7 days.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, anyone else on this particular question?
I guess my only thoughts are like, like just on how this might be affecting Native communities. I can listen, I can learn, and I'm trying to continually just find what are saying about this, whether that's renaming the day, whether that's trying to change education and how we teach, incorporate it into schooling. So I'm just and learning more.
Thank you. You cut off a little bit down there, Amanda, but we got most of everything that you were saying. Okay. It looks like we may have a question in the chat. If I can find the chat, give me 1 second. But as I look for that question, I'll move on to the next question, and then I will find that and ask that next, okay? All right, so history tells us that pilgrims came to the New World in search of religious freedom and to fulfill a fateful mission to build an ideal Christian commonwealth. Was this idea of religious freedom oxymoronic? How did this idea of religious freedom shape the institution of holidays and colonialism overall in the United States?
I'm happy to start on this one. I have
Okie dokie.
I have a lot of thoughts on religious freedom as a term. I think from my studies, it's been very clear that that solely applies to Protestant white Christians in America. That's who came over on the Mayflower, and that's the community that they wanted to create a space for. Like a lot of my studies have just revealed how that's the understanding of religion that we use in America. This like Protestant belief that religion is a belief. It is an individual belief. It is something you can remove from your community or take anywhere you want. That does not apply to many other versions of religion or spirituality. So just kind of take religious freedom as a term with a grain of salt moving forward.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a good perspective, Amanda. Anyone else for this particular question?
Yeah, I just want to second what Amanda said. Religious freedom meant freedom for them, not for everyone else. I mean, the witch burnings, it's, I've been doing a lot of reading about that lately because Halloween. And yeah, I think that's, they didn't even wait 10 years before they got over here before they started turning on other people. So their own kind, right, for their religious beliefs. So yeah, that honorable idea, not so honorable execution.
Thank you, Sheena.
That was
All
such a
right.
great point that Amanda made. I just want to emphasize it about how, for a lot of folks, um, religion is not portable, right? It's tied to where you are. It's tied to the earth. It's tied to, you can't just pick it up and isolate it as some random ideas and go around and convince other people of these ideas. It's such a narrow conception of what religion is, among many other things.
Thank you for the addition. All right, so I was able to find our question from one of our participants. So this is in regard to the question or the commentary around the Atlanta Braves that Dr. Kaysen spoke on. So loosely connected question, they said, do any of the panelists have opinions on the ATL Braves name or on the tomahawk chop?
I have a lot of opinions. The tomahawk chop needs to go. Just it needs to go. It's not even. I don't even want to hear the conversations about. Well, it's tradition. Atlanta stole that from Florida State University in the '90s, trying to piggyback off Florida State's popularity. I was a sports journalist before I moved to nonprofits. So I know my sports. So the tomahawk chop should have never even been here. And the Braves need to stop. It allows, maybe in the grand scheme of things, it's not the worst thing, but what it does is it allows people to play Indian. It allows people to, what's the word? I can never remember this word. Okay, well, whatever. We'll move on. But it
Culturally appropriate?
well, yeah. What's the drawings that people do where your features are really exaggerated?
Caricature?
Caricatures.
Oh my God, I need to write that down somewhere because I never can remember that word. Yeah, now I can't pronounce it. Native cultures, and it allows people to to be racist. The more you mock and turn a culture or a people into something that's not real, the easier it is for that group of people to be erased in your mind, and therefore the easier it is to perpetuate genocide. That's just, that's just how I feel about that. With the Braves, I think, listen, I love Atlanta, and I was really excited that they won the World Series. Again, I'm a sports person, and I was so happy to see that we finally got something. I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities. We've got Atlanta United. I can't remember who wrote it, and I think it was for Creative Loafing a few years ago. But someone wrote an opinion piece about, why not the Atlanta Brave? And I love that. Or like, I still don't understand why we don't have the Atlanta Phoenix or Phoenixes or something like that, because we're the city that rose up, right? We rose from the ashes. So I think there's so much cool stuff that we could do with our World Championship baseball team that doesn't need to have anything to do with anyone else's culture, much less Indigenous. So
Thank you, Sheena.
pop off for the day.
All right. Anyone else want to chime in on that question from one of our participants before we move back into our regularly scheduled questions?
I would add that I don't want to hear anyone say if it's just a mascot, because if it's just a mascot, then change it, right? As soon as you take a defensive position that says it's just this, then that's the point exactly. If it's just that to you, there should be zero problem with picking a new thing. And, this is true for every square inch of this continent, but the lack of acknowledgement of removal history and the complexities of removal in this city already, and then to layer that on top of it, it makes me sick to my stomach every time. That those cheers, Indigenous people are, as Shana pointed out, she loves sports. Like, Indigenous people are allowed to enjoy things without being mocked. I mean, that it's just selfish to want to keep something that doesn't allow other people to also enjoy something. So yes, in terms of do people have opinions, I could go on all day on my opinions on this, but I think maybe I've made my point, I think.
I do want to add one thing that I left off that was mentioned briefly earlier, but Indigenous youth have one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And the American Psychological Association, I want to say in 2015, maybe even earlier, I could be wrong, again, don't fact check me on dates, did a study, and sports mascots directly relate to suicide rates in Indian country. And they called for a complete removal. It might have been 2005, or that might have been the NCAA. But anyway, they called for immediate removal of all sports, school associated, anything kind of mascots, because it's directly related to our suicide rates. And again, these suicide rates are mostly children.
Thank you for sharing, Sheena. All right, moving to our final three questions of our conversation today. On Columbus's first trip to the Caribbean, rape and pillaging became rampant as well as tolerated by Columbus. How does this long history of violence against Native women connect us to the current conditions of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit individuals? Does anyone want to start with that one? Sheena, you were ready, but I don't want to assume.
I'm thinking. I've never thought
Absolutely.
of that before, but yeah. I think it's kind of what we've been saying this whole time of erasure, dehumanizing people and people becoming, necessarily real. I think there's a fetish issue here, exoticism, that kind of thing. I don't know, maybe someone else can speak while I gather my thoughts.
I can chime in.
Absolutely.
I was thinking that that word you were use of erasure, Sheena, like I think that's the big idea for me here. Like it's really easy to erase that history, to just forget it happened. And it's really easy to forget that Indigenous people are still here and like in our country, in our communities today, and just like, I don't need to think about them. They're like on their own land, they're living their own lives, but like they're still here, they're still part of our country. And I think just that erasing of those experiences is what's key for me.
Thank you, Amanda. Dr. Kaysen or Dr. Saito?
I just think about how closely tied it is to extraction, right? Extraction for profit, and um, how indigenous peoples have been seen by Columbus and colonizers ever since as another resource to be exploited. And that sort of brings us all the way up to current issues with these so-called man camps around the oil pipeline things, and the incredible rates of sexual violence that everybody knows comes with them. Um, and yet nothing effective is being done because it's all, I mean, it is erased in the sense of it's disappeared from our consciousness, but also it's part of this whole, some resources get sacrificed in the quest for, profit and oil and energy and all of those things. It's part of that whole narrative that we've been talking about this whole panel.
There's also, I'm glad you mentioned the man camps. For anyone who doesn't know, we're talking about oil industry and pipelines being built and stuff like that out in the Dakotas, and other areas around there, but mostly North Dakota. The other issue too is there's a lot of barriers in terms of law enforcement and prosecution. I am not aware. Sometimes I like to think I am, but I'm not. As I understand, there's the tribe can't prosecute non-tribal individuals. There's a lot of barriers like that. But of course, at that point, it's already happened. Someone's already been attacked. Someone's already been assaulted. So the law is kind of a band-aid on a bigger problem. In the Violence Against Women Act, too, I believe, at least in Alaska, it had some stipulations that weren't renewed when the act was renewed recently. Sorry, I need to work on my dates or take notes or something.
I think another thing to connect it to with this history of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and yes, it's there in the history of Columbus, but also something that some Cherokee scholars and elders have mentioned to me, and I haven't independently verified this, but a thing I have been told is even in the Southeast, you'll sometimes hear people say their great-great-grandmother is a Cherokee princess, and that term actually appears in the kidnapping and sale of Cherokee young women and girls during the pre-removal and around the removal period, as sort of a marketing of wives. And so if you invoke that even in a way because you had heard that was true, I mean, Cherokee people don't have princesses, so it's not true, but where the genesis of that term and their understanding came from was it was a term that was used directly to the sex trafficking and exploitation of young Cherokee women in the Southern Appalachians and surrounding communities. And so to even say that, before you use words, try to understand what you're evoking and what histories you may be participating in and making light of. And so everything about the sexual violence towards Indigenous women creeps into so much of American culture in ways that people aren't even aware of, that it's always good to pause and ask ourselves, where does this idea even come from? And is that something that I want to invoke and repeat and carry that idea forward? Even if I think I'm saying it as a joke. It's not funny, and why, if you know the history, why would you think it was a joke?
It's like a tiger lily symptom. I don't know. I've been thinking about Peter Pan a lot during this conversation. So I think because again, your appropriation doesn't have to necessarily take a mean or violent turn to be harmful. And so I've been really thinking about Peter Pan and Tiger Lily.
Thank you all for your contribution on this particular question. Were there any more commentary or comments around this question that we wanted to add before we move on to our next one? All right. So, in many Latin American nations, the anniversary of Columbus's landing has traditionally been observed as the Dia de la Raza, or the Day of the Race, a celebration of Hispanic culture's diverse roots. In 2002, Venezuela named the holiday Dia de la Resistencia Indigena. Ooh, I think I butchered that terribly, which is the Day of the Indigenous Resistance, to recognize Native peoples and their experience. Several U.S. cities and states have replaced Columbus Day with alternative days of remembrance known as Indigenous Peoples Day. On October 11th, 2021, this year, the United States celebrated its first National Indigenous Peoples Day, in which President Joe Biden proclaimed as a day to honor our diverse history and the Indigenous peoples who contribute to shaping this nation. What does this proclamation mean to the Native communities? How do Indigenous people continue to reclaim their land, their narratives, and their communities? And we'll start with Sheena, and then we'll move to anyone else who'd like to particularly answer this question.
Yeah. So I think it's really exciting. I believe Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom did a proclamation for Indigenous Peoples Day a few years ago for the city of Atlanta. So shout out to her for that. So it was exciting to see Joe do this. For me personally, it's been a lot lately. The time between Columbus Day and Thanksgiving is usually really just a lot, and then you've got the World Series on top of it. And I work, again, I'm the education manager for the Native American Journalists Association, so I feel like I've been getting it from all sides. So while it's exciting to have these things finally recognized, it's not enough. It can be performative. And check in on your Indigenous friends, because we're very tired. So I don't want to sound like I'm complaining or ungrateful, because I definitely am. I think it's long past time that some of these things are being done, but again, especially this time of year, I get kind of tired sometimes of being asked to do land acknowledgements only in November. That's, why didn't you call me in June? So that's
Totally understandable. Thank you, Sheena.
Yeah.
Amanda, Dr. Kaysen, or Dr. Saito? All right, nothing on this one. Well, we'll move to our final question of our conversation. So, teaching more accurate and complete narratives is key to our society's rethinking its history. What are some ways that we can raise awareness of the rich history, culture, and traditions of the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, while also dispelling the romanticized retelling of American history? Or will false narratives be continuously reproduced in our society? And we'll go in the order of our introductions. How about that? So we'll start with Dr. Kaysen. We'll move to Sheena. Oh, no, I believe we started with Sheena. So we started with Sheena, Dr. Kaysen, Amanda, and then Dr. Saito.
Okay, I feel like I've talked too much during this thing. I think, me personally, I think it's important, like I'll use Peter Pan since I brought that up. I don't want to go too far down the road of just get rid of it and no one's allowed to ever see that movie again, or read that book again. I think we need to be more, like, use it as a teaching tool. Use these false narratives that have been developed. Don't just necessarily, I mean, some of them, yeah, maybe just get rid of and don't ever mention again. But some of them, and again, I just especially think of kids, young children. Use it as a teaching tool. This is a hard question for me because to raise awareness, we need things like Indigenous Peoples Day, and we need things like land acknowledgements. But then again, on the flip side, I just complained about being so tired of doing all this kind of stuff. So I think we need allies, and I think a really big thing is put your money where your mouth is. A friend and I recently did a land acknowledgement for a band at Shaky Knees Festival, and they gave us $1,000 toward our nonprofit. So that is actual, money that we can use to do things. It wasn't just lip service. So I think being genuine. And I mean, not everyone has $1,000 to give me, unfortunately, but yeah, just be genuine and don't have it just be performative, not just in November. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Thank you, Sheena. Dr. Kaysen?
I mean, as a literature professor, I obviously believe in narrative. I think a lot of times we see that our policy and law follows a shift in a cultural awareness and narrative. And because elected officials like to be elected, if there is a sense in what a cultural narrative's understanding is, that is a space where things and change can happen. But, yes, we need narratives to help us imagine the future we want, but I think particularly I agree with Sheena 100% about land acknowledgements. Again, if I steal your laptop and then say my friend Katja talks about this all the time, but I mean, so I'm stealing this from her. She's amazing. But if I steal your laptop, it's not good enough for me to say, like, I acknowledge I stole your laptop. And then you're like, yes, but can I have it back? Be like, no, I put all my programs on it. So thank you. I acknowledge I stole this laptop. That's not really good enough, is it? You wouldn't feel satisfied with that. And so for me, I think it's becoming more and more about honor taxes, thinking about the current, take the narrative and think about things like the current tax code and what organizations owe to the state of Georgia versus what do they owe to the tribes and the groups that this is their land. So really any place that narrative is a great place to start. At my Indigenous literature classes are open to all. I welcome all undergrads to come take them. But then thinking about what the next step is, I've said in many forums at this university that the next step, I think, is I'm happy that I was able to get those courses on the books. I'm a non-native person. We need to hire Indigenous faculty. We need to support Indigenous faculty, and there need to be, for me, you learn narratives and then you figure out what is your own pedagogy of obsolescence. The point is that Indigenous people need to be supported and represented at this university for these issues and this education and teaching and talking about these narratives. So I think it's about learning. Learning is open to all, being a good ally, and then recognizing that being a good ally is about material things and not being stuck and centering yourself in that process.
Thank you, Dr. Kaysen, Amanda, and then we'll close out with Dr. Saito.
Yeah, so for me, I'm thinking of this as an educator. And like the first thing I think of is incorporate Native voices. Indigenous people are sharing their thoughts on how they want to people to learn about them or to be represented. So I can go do that research and find some best practices. Secondly, like especially like when teaching Indigenous religions, you want to shy away from some stereotypes, like a categorization that all Indigenous religions are the same or that they share commonalities. Like you can draw some categories, but also incorporate the diversity and make sure you're acknowledging there's a vast array of practices happening in our country and across the world. This is not one monolithic thing. Another thing that I've seen in some classes is like tend to historicize or make this like past tense. Like Indigenous religions are happening today, they're evolving today, they are present today. And so just kind of, we can do as an educator, I can like combat some of those stereotypes that my students might bring from their education. Like, no, it's not just a past thing, it's being lived today in many different ways.
And
Thank you, Amanda.
that's
And
really
last,
what I wanted to say too, was that
gotcha.
one of the things I think is most important right now is to, people, non-Indigenous people seem to find it really easy to be very sympathetic about what happened to Indigenous peoples past tense, right? And there used to be Indians here, there used to be whatever. And I just think it's so important to try to, whoever we come in contact with, right, to call out that past tense frame of mind and that past tense language, and to talk about current struggles and current people. I'm teaching a race law class now, and I have students who are very sympathetic, but they could not name, out of the entire class, they could not name one contemporary American Indian prominent person, period, contemporary, right? Not one. And so, just like you said, like there's a current reality out there that just sort of existing in this parallel universe to the mainstream consciousness. And I think we have to start really exposing people to the reality that the world we see around us is just a bubble, and we've got to pierce that bubble.
Thank you so much for closing us out, Dr. Saito. So thank you, panelists, again for this wonderful conversation in recognition of Native American Indian Heritage Month. This has been recorded. So if you are watching and you would like to watch this wonderful panel again, feel free to check this out on our YouTube series, our YouTube channel rather, for our Talk Tuesday series. But without further ado, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and thank you all so much for this wonderful dialogue. Have a great day.
Thank you, William, for organizing it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank